This is Proxy Countdown. Welcome to the big show for the week of May 13, 2024. Alongside my tag team partner, Matt Mascardi, I'm Damian Rollis. On today's countdown, a new director at Exxon that shareholders cannot vote on. Shareholders at Tesla are being threatened to support its CEO. Exxon's thoughts on shareholder democracy. A non-sugar sweetener shareholder proposal at Pepsi, and a non-human primate proposal at Charles River Laboratories. And on the big vote, we look at the dirty three: Chevron, Exxon, and Shell. Let's get to our trade wire. At WEC Energy Group, Gail Klappa has transitioned from executive chair to non-executive chair. According to the filing, in light of the company's performance during Mr. Klappa's tenure as executive chair and his significant contributions to that performance, the Compensation Committee approved the acceleration of the vesting of unvested shares for Mr. Klappa. So this may be the official green light to attach all company performance to the board members, positive or negative.
Yeah, I like that.
Also, Mr. Klappa will be entitled to an annual retainer fee of $120,000 and equity valued at $160,000. On top of that, according to the company, in recognition of his service as non-executive chair, in the additional duties that entails, the committee determined Mr. Klappa will receive an additional annual retainer fee of $187,500.
He wasn't getting enough. I like the extra $500 there, too.
Yeah, shareholders at WEC Energy Group, your board is making stuff up as they go along. Make a mental note. As part of AbbVie's leadership transition, where Robert Michael will become the new CEO and former CEO Richard Gonzalez will become executive chair, the company announced that the former CEO and new executive chair's base salary will be $1.5 million, and that he will continue to participate in the company's bonus plan. So to be clear, the chair of the group tasked to provide oversight of AbbVie management will be the second highest paid employee at the company, making even more than the chief operating officer.
That sounds like accountability in action.
After ExxonMobil's merger with Pioneer Natural Resources, Maria Dreyfus was added to the board. But according to the filing, Ms. Dreyfus will not be included with the company's nominees for election by shareholders at the company's annual meeting in May, but will be reappointed by the board immediately thereafter for a full term. I've never seen that in my entire life.
Look, that's brilliant. If you don't want anyone to weigh in on something, I don't know why they just fire everybody on the board the day before the AGM and reappoint them the day after.
And lastly, at Aspen Technology, board chair Jill Smith resigned last week and was replaced by Robert Whelan Jr. This means that there is currently only one woman on the board of Aspen Technology. That's Karen Goltz with 2% influence.
2? Wow.
Let's go to our proxy cage matches. We don't have traditional proxy cage matches to report on this week, but there's two companies I wanted to highlight. First, at Tesla, which never buys ads, is now buying ads to promote Elon Musk's record $52 billion pay deal before the company's annual meeting. Multiple filings refer to an 1,100% total shareholder return since Elon's award was granted in March 2018. But the footnote unfortunately cuts off the math at the end of 2023 when the share price was $248 and not at today's $174.
No, that's convenient.
And how about this actual filing to shareholders that posts a portion of a recent earnings call? I'm sorry, Matt. I had to do this. I have to read this because this is the state of investorship and board oversight at Tesla. This is an actual filing with the SEC. I'll try to do this quickly. The question to Elon was, the thesis hinges completely on AI, the future of AI, full self-driving, neutral net training, all of these things. In that context, Elon, you've spoken about your desire to obtain 25% voting control of the company. So here's essentially the answer by Elon Musk referring to how is he gonna manage to attain this 25% of ownership. Here's what Elon said verbatim. Well, I think no matter what Tesla, even if I got kidnapped by aliens tomorrow, Tesla will solve autonomy, maybe a little slower, but it would solve autonomy for vehicles at least. I don't know if it would win with respect to Optimus or with respect to future products, but it would. But there's enough momentum for Tesla to solve autonomy, even if I disappeared for vehicles. Now, there's a whole range of things we can do in the future beyond that. I'd be more reticent with respect to Optimus. If we have a super sentient humanoid robot that can follow you indoors and that you can't escape, we're talking Terminator level risk, then I'd be uncomfortable with, if there's not some meaningful level of influence over how that is deployed. He also says, and if there's, shareholders have an opportunity to ratify or ratify the compensation. So, Matt, he's basically saying
Wait a minute.
that if he doesn't get increased influence at Tesla, then it's possible that the robots they're building may start following you around and shooting you like Terminator. This is the logic. This is the reasoning going on at Tesla.
I want 25% control of the company so that the robots that we make don't kill you.
Is that not a veiled threat to shareholders? If I've ever seen one?
That's a veiled threat to humanity. Forget shareholders.
Crazy. And please, we're not talking about Tesla this week, but vote against his pay and vote against Kimball Musk. Just do your job, shareholders. And finally, Exxon is fighting back against Glass Lewis. The company filed its letter to Glass Lewis to respond to the proxy advisor's decision to vote against Exxon lead director Joseph Hooley. In the letter, Exxon asked Glass Lewis to recuse itself from all opinions on Exxon due to conflicts of interest involving other shareholder groups, which is essentially Glass Lewis's job. One of the letter's key takeaways is this quote from Exxon. For shareholder democracy to be real, a no needs to mean no. So, Matt, I think Exxon may have unwittingly opened the door for all proposals at American companies to become fully binding.
Oh, I love that.
A no means no, and a yes means yes.
I like that. Except that does very much mean that no one votes against management. So we know what the votes actually look like. So that would be stifling, but it would be nice if things weren't binding when they did pass. Or we're binding, rather.
Stay tuned in today's show. We are covering Chevron, Exxon, and Shell. Before we do that, let's move over to our vote results table. AGM season is in full swing. So we took last week off, Matt, which means that I looked at 90 annual meetings from May 3rd to the May 15th. Now, I only looked at the largest cap companies in America, but I still had to go through 90 filings. Yes, I opened up all 90 filings. Of those, I took notes on only 1/3 of meeting results, which means essentially that at the other 60 companies, nothing is happening. Absolutely nothing. Shareholders are just blanket supporting everything they see. There's no due diligence. There's no Glass Lewis, trying to shift the
There's
future.
no performance metrics because it's not possible that like 2/3 of companies outperform. It doesn't seem possible.
Some of these meetings include well-known companies like Occidental Petroleum, MGM Resorts, General Electric, Philip Morris. At Exxon, in fact, average director support was 99%. 99%. All right. So the vast majority of directors received well over 90% support. Only 9 directors out of roughly 900 received more than 20% votes withheld. That includes David Trujillo at Uber Technologies, who received 44% against, but it's only because he failed attendance. This seems to be the one thing that shareholders recognize as a problem. The only thing is being below this arbitrary 75% threshold that is included within proxy statement. That's it.
You had a cold one day, doesn't show up, vote him off. And that's the policy. Doesn't matter if he's the worst performer on the board.
Nothing else matters. Other directors receiving over 20% against include Barry Diller at Coke, Andrew Laveris at IBM, Micheline Chow and Louis Kramer at Las Vegas Sands. But Matt, the real winner is a man named John Zillmer. He sits on the boards of CSX and Ecolab at both companies. He received 25% votes against his. So if you do the math and combine them, I think he should just leave the boards of both companies, honestly. There was wide support for pay practices as well, despite growing media coverage over excessively high CEO to worker pay ratios and massive pay packages. So out of the 90 companies, I only counted three companies that showed considerable dissent. Only three. Las Vegas Sands, 35% voted no. Fortune Brands Innovations, 32% against. And at Exxon Enterprise, Say on Pay barely passed with 50.4% of the vote.
Wow.
Despite this, Pay Committee Chair Hadi Partovi, 94% yes.
That doesn't make any sense. You
Incredible.
know that chair does the pay.
In other management proposals, shareholders approved an amendment at Pulte Group's articles of incorporation to eliminate the 69.3% supermajority voting requirements. How about that? They had a 69.3% supermajority voting requirement. I don't understand.
I
that
love
one.
0.3%.
A proposal to amend articles to eliminate supermajority voting provisions did not receive the required vote of 80% of outstanding shares at Eli Lilly. This is a crazy one. I hate reporting on this one. So they need 80% of outstanding shares, despite the fact that 86% of the voters voted to amend it. It didn't pass because there's this onerous rule at Eli Lilly. And at Ecolab, an auditor, PricewaterhouseCoopers, actually received 12% votes against their ratification. You don't ever really see that, do you?
You don't see that much. But I will say this. Investors, there's a lesson here.
Mm-hmm.
When you agree to a thing like supermajority voting provisions, like dual class shares, it is really hard, if not impossible, to repeal them, right? Like even when you want to.
Yeah. Moving over to the world of shareholder proposals, there's ongoing success for only one proposal this year. That's simple majority voting, passing at both IDEX Laboratories and Stryker, nearly passing at AbbVie with 49% saying yes. So hopefully AbbVie does the right thing. There's only one real outlier here, which was Molina Healthcare, where only 9% support the proposal. I don't understand why it's passing everywhere, but I don't understand the shareholders. At
Maybe no one
Healthcare.
cares about Molina Healthcare.
Beyond simple majority voting, near shareholder proposal misses include a report on the effectiveness of DEI efforts at Expeditors International of Washington. That was from As You Sow. That received 35% support. And a proposal to call a special meeting at Steel Dynamics fell just short at 41%. Matt, I wanted to point out my three favorite sounding shareholder proposals over this term. They all failed. At Kraft Heinz, a report on group housed pork failed.
Interesting.
Group housed pork. Is that a fancy way of saying pigs living in the same cage?
In the same
together?
house. Yeah. Same.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
crates.
I like that. Group house pork. At Pepsi, a third-party assessment on non-sugar sweetener risks failed.
That's
I like that
oddly
one.
specific,
Non-sugar sweetener risks.
Yeah.
What about the risks of all of Pepsi's products? I mean,
Yeah,
they all carry
eating-
inherent risks. Everything.
Eating all of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And finally, at Charles River Laboratories, a report on non-human primates imported by the company failed. Non-human primates imported. But where are they imported from? Like
First,
a Nordstrom in France? I don't know where they're
There's a
coming
lot
from.
to unpack there because why specify non-human? Was there some confusion about the human primates that they were importing? Those ones are off the table.
Yeah. And finally, in my "You are all governance heroes to me" category, these are some of my favorite proposals over the last 10 days. A proposal to reduce the voting power of UPS Class A stock from 10 votes per share to 1 vote per share. It failed, but it did receive 36% yes votes. I applaud you, John Chevron. At United Rentals, shareholders wanted directors to be elected by majority vote, right? Enough said. But only 15% of shareholders went along with that. Why? 15%. At Ford Motor Company, another one from John Chevron, he put up a 1 vote, 1 share proposal. Despite the Ford family's 40% voting power, this one received 38% support. That's incredible.
That is pretty good.
A proposal requesting a railroad safety committee at CSX. That seems like a no-brainer. Only 8% said yes. Only 8% want that. That's from the AFL-CIO. And finally, my favorite, at Gilead Sciences, a shareholder proposal requesting that the board include one member from the company's non-management employees received only 6% support.
Nobody likes employee
why?
representation on the board.
What is the harm? What is the harm? You already have the CEO on every board. You can't have a worker sitting there.
Damien, that's why you have HR, to talk to them so we don't have to.
I applaud you, shareholders at Gilead Sciences, for that one. I love that one. That's it. That's a lot. Matt, I know you post these on LinkedIn every week, so if you want to know the details of any of this, Matt will put that in that post. So now let's move over to the big vote. Again, we're doing something different this week because there's just an onslaught of companies to cover. So what we thought we'd do is, again, we're only focusing on the largest cap companies. In terms of our data, we call those League 3 and League 4 companies. There's only about roughly, 600 in the world? Is that right? Or is that the U.S.?
Yeah, it's, in the U.S., it's about 550.
So and roughly the S&P 500.
Is like 1,000.
So, Matt, we decided this week, because we have 3 meetings coming up at big oil companies. That's Chevron on May 31st. That's Exxon on May 29th. And then we have Shell. Shell's not an American company, but we thought we'd cover it. That's coming up this weekend, May 21st. So, Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, there's a lot here, and I'm going to introduce some new concepts, but stick with me, all right? First, we need to agree on some rules before we cover oil and gas, because I looked at the entire sector. I didn't just look at the big 3. I'm going to give recommendations on the big 3, but I looked at the entire sector. The rules we need to agree on are, number 1, directors are guardrails. They're not alpha generation, it's asset protection. You are picking them for that. Number 2, directors are hired by the investors. They're chosen by investors for long-term asset protection. Mm-hmm. So they're guardrails over the long term. And number 3, and this is the big one for oil and gas, climate change is the most fundamental long-term risk facing this and arguably any sector, right?
Right, but especially this sector, of course.
So you got to, if you don't think that those rules apply, that climate change is not real, you don't care about directors for the long term, they're just sitting there for a little while, directors shouldn't be guardrails, they don't even need to be there. If you disagree with those 3 rules, then none of this will really make that much sense with you. You might as well just stop right now. Yeah. Congratulations.
Why are you even listening to us anyway, if that's what you believe?
So with that as the backdrop, right? The current revenue model for this sector, as we all know, is they just sell energy conversion. They suck something out of the ground of some kind, usually a liquid or a solid, and then they transform it into fire, a physical product, and plastics, and the byproduct of which is pollution and effectively climate change at this point. We can all roughly agree that that's what they do. We know that direct sales of oil and gas is like 4% of the global economy-ish, and the second order economy is magnitudes larger, like plastics and glues and paints and whatever other things that they make. The investor economy, so there was this interesting report by Deloitte that surveyed investors and found that 75% of investors, institutional investors, expect a 3+% dividend payout from the sector. When you think about that, that means the directors that our investors are putting there, the expectation on them is that they approve dividends. To get dividends, you must have constant and consistent cash flow. This becomes important when you're talking about a sector that needs to pivot from being a legacy sector sucking dino juice out of the ground and burning it to effectively a startup model. It needs to transition its entire business model over the next decade to doing other things with whatever it pulls out of the ground. It doesn't matter if it keeps pulling it out of the ground, but it does have to do other things with it. It has to begin to do other things.
Are you suggesting that this allegiance to dividend payouts might get in the way of innovation,
That's
R&D,
exactly
that type of thing?
What I'm suggesting. If you are beholden to if any of these companies were to say, we're going to cut the dividend, we're going to spend that on basically R&D to pivot our way out, there's likely an investor revolt, given that 2/3 or 3/4 of investors expect them to pay them the cash flows. That is a lot of pressure on management to not pivot, to keep doing what you're doing to pay that dividend.
It's interesting you say that because Exxon, especially out of these three companies, is going out of its way to be anti-shareholder. Especially
In this
proxy
go-around,
season,
no doubt.
suing. We've reported on this several times. Suing Arjuna Capital and follow this, right? Large sections of the proxy dedicated to complaining about shareholder proposals and activists. They're sending out letters to Glass Lewis, but the core reasoning here. And we both watched a 45-minute interview with CEO Darren Woods talking about this week. The core part of their argument is that we can't do anything because it's against the interests of shareholders. Shareholders don't want it. This is all about the shareholders, right? Shareholder. Right?
Yes. And Woods himself is, Exxon in particular, is differentiating between shareholders that they agree with effectively and shareholders like the real shareholders, right? Mm-hmm. Which he actually says. And then shareholders who are hijacking, quote unquote, the process.
And abusing this,
abusing the system, yep. Right? Mm-hmm. Effectively, there are shareholders who recognize the transition is coming and need more and more information about how you are planning to deal with this transition, not in vague terms, but in specific terms, because your job is to be a long-lived asset for us. And then there's these other shareholders that are asking for 3% annual dividends, where the transition is much harder to actually manage. And Woods himself is sort of differentiating between them. So that becomes important. All right, let's talk demographics. Who's in the sector? This is where it becomes interesting to us. The entire integrated oil and gas sub-industry has 289 active directors. There's about 24 companies. There are 186 active directors that aren't executives at the company, family members, government representation, employees, because this sector
true independent agents of oversight.
So we are talking about 186 out of 289 directors, where if you are an investor, that is your target cohort. That is who you elect, that like with your direct vote. No questions asked. That's for you. These are relatively young people. They're in their early 60s relative to other directors who are in their mid 60s on average. 35% of them are female. They're actually higher than the global average percentage for female directorship. They're not even long tenured directors. 10% of them have been on their boards for 10 years or more. So that means 90% are pretty new. This is the funny part is 3 of the longest lived tenured directors are on the Chevron board. We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing that stuck out to me was the Exxon board. The longest tenured director is Angela Braley. She's only been there since 2016.
Yeah, the turnover on these boards is actually pretty strong, and partially because this is a very mature sector. They have smart director rotation. They have highly connected individuals on the board, which is like a hidden source of tenure, right? Like if all your friends are just cycling through all these different boards, you effectively get sort of groupthink tenure versus actual body tenure, to put it that way. The average of these independent directors is they sit on 1.2 boards on average, which means they're almost all multi-boarders and more than 2 in many cases. And when it comes to performance, 47 of the 186 are unrated. They just joined, so you can ignore them entirely, which gives us roughly 140 directors, 60 of whom have above average carbon intensity performance and 46 of whom are below average. It's a fairly even split when it comes to that. TSR is where they stink. The full average for the sector is 436, batting TSR, where 500 is exactly average. And only Shell's board of the big 3 bats above average for TSR. So you are getting carbon without returns. In fact, in the last 5 years, the entire oil and gas, the global oil and gas sector stock return is negative 1.8% that's 10 years, the last 10 years. So you're not getting returns for the byproduct of what they're producing at this point. So the big question here is, looking at the demographics of the sector, are the people who are on the oil and gas boards the shepherds, the right shepherds for a new future? Are they the guardrails for long-term viability of the sector in the face of climate change?
Okay.
Let's start by looking at, we're going to look at this in 3 ways. Number 1, influence. Do the investors have an interest, influential power on these boards such that they can actually change the direction of them? Number two, this is the new part for us, knowledge. We did a super deep dive. We've used, I'll get into it, but we've been able to actually assess the knowledge base of every board and every director on those boards. And we want to know, do the directors actually have the knowledge or skills to pivot from a legacy asset to a future asset? And number three is performance. Do they actually have a track record of outperforming on any of these things?
Okay.
I'm going to try to move as fast as possible. There's so much here.
Let's start with influence.
Let's start with influence. All right. At 10 of the 24 integrated oil and gas companies, the majority of the top influencers are independent directors, meaning about half of the companies that we're looking at, investors have a say in the majority of influence.
Yeah, this is a sector that's notably not full of dictatorships.
It's not. Well, there are state dictatorships, which is a different problem, but not management dictatorships.
Relative to, say, big tech here in the United States, it's a much different ownership group.
Exactly. And in fact, the big three, Exxon, Chevron, and Shell, are some of the most democratic. 50% of the board influence is held by the top third of the board. So a full third of the board it takes to get to 50%. These are our top targets. The reason why we chose the big three in part is because they are democratically elected. They are not state-run orgs. There's a lot of opportunity to create influence voids. You can take a director and create a vacancy that will be a high influence vacancy. So you can replace them with a knowledge or skill set that you want or top performers. So that's why those are the companies that we chose. Now let's talk about knowledge, the actual knowledge you want on these boards. So we're rolling this out. This is very alpha. It's not even quite beta. It's a knowledge map for every single board, 9,500 companies in the world.
A knowledge map.
A knowledge map. We use the industry exposure, the industry that a director has worked in, where have they actually worked, and what are the common skills in that industry. So if you worked in aerospace, we're not assuming that you're an engineer, but you do have to know the mechanical process of being in aerospace. We actually are using over 30 Bureau of Labor Statistics, occupational databases, and mapped the titles of these directors, which is the second part of this, titles and roles of these companies, the titles of the directors, and the titles that are most prevalent in industries to understand, okay, what are the knowledge sets inside this industry? What's the common knowledge?
And to be clear, you have to have worked at an aerospace company, as an example. You can't just be a director at an aerospace
Exactly.
company.
You have to have direct experience. We're not saying directorships. We're saying direct experience. And we can look at your titles in your resume and say, what skills are associated, what knowledge is associated with that title. So if you're the chief marketing officer, there's obvious knowledge that you need to have about marketing and sales and communications, things that are, associated with that title. And this isn't us making it up. This is built off of surveys of thousands of companies in the US. So we're using that as our proxy. And then finally, education. We actually went through degrees and we said, what focus do directors have? Did they hit on, and what are the base knowledge required? So if you got an engineering degree, there's some base level of math, engineering, obviously. Like there's some base knowledge you have to have when you have those degrees. By doing this, we can figure out that, by example, a director who is the CFO at an airplane manufacturing with a degree in economics, what is the basic knowledge that they're likely to have? They're likely to have some mechanical knowledge from working in the airplane industry. They were the CFO and they got an economics degree. So we can actually say the likelihood is that they spent all of their time on economics, accounting, that type of knowledge, less so on engineering, production. They're not going to do those things, right? We can do this for every single director. And let's do this for the entire industry.
Okay.
The first thing that we did, we looked at all of the independent directors, the 186 independent directors, and we said, okay, actually, I think I did every single director for the entire industry. And I said, what is the base knowledge? The base knowledge is a mechanical knowledge. It's effectively they know how to build stuff. the process of building stuff. I can manage the building process. The second highest knowledge set was economics and accounting.
But again, that you're saying that will include executive directors, not just
That
independent
will
directors.
include executives.
Okay.
And the reason why I say that is because the important thing I'm looking for when I'm doing this is what is the gap of knowledge between a non-executive director and executives. Mm-hmm. What we found was the majority of the mechanical skills were actually held by the executives. So executives know how to build these things. They know how to go out and mine. They know how to pump gas. They know how to the process of doing this. But the people on the board do not.
Who are providing oversight do not have that.
Who
knowledge.
do not on average necessarily have that skill, which means you have this power gap, right? If you walk into a room and there's only one person or maybe two people who have ever pumped gas before out of the ground, know that production process. How comfortable are you raising your hand and saying, are we doing this right? Should we pivot? We need to pivot to something.
Is this not the exact same argument that Elon Musk was making? That you need me to figure this out, right?
Right.
Essentially.
Well,
right? You're beholden to management to figure this out.
It's oddly similar to the Disney situation, right? Where Iger was the only one with media experience on the board before they got activists and they brought in other media executives to the board.
This is why I've been making the case over and over and over that modern day American boards are not actually providing oversight. They're not actually representing a diverse set of skills. They're actually there to play defense for the management and really for the CEO.
That's right.
They're there to ensure that the CEO who's often the chair gets to make decisions, right? Gets to do what they want in the short time that they're actually at the company, because the tenure of CEOs and CFOs is already pretty low. So the board just seems to ensure that they can do whatever they want in those 5 years and then get out.
It's effectively a way of sort of consolidating power with management by having as short tenured. In fact, the average tenure in this sector is 5.5 years, where on average in other across global publicly traded companies is 7. They actually are on the boards less here. They have less direct experience or knowledge in what the companies do. They actually tend to have the economics and accounting on the board is almost entirely the investor selected representatives. So investors are routinely choosing people who have backgrounds in economics, backgrounds in finance. They come from investor. They're selecting themselves to sit on the board.
Right,
but you don't innovate by doing that.
There is a caveat to that, which is that the board itself are nominated. These are uncontested elections. The board itself are nominating the directors, and investors are invariably saying yes to everybody. 96% support.
That's true.
Right. So I think what you're suggesting is that they might want to look at the makeup of the board a little more closely, right?
Right.
Not just rubber stamp everything that the board throws in front of you.
Which is funny, too, because we see, unlike in oil and gas where we have this gap, we see in something like healthcare or biotech, the exact opposite is true. You tend to actually see boards full of high expertise people. I looked at Vertex Pharmaceuticals as just because I wanted to get a baseline. I wanted to get an example. And engineering and technology is the number one knowledge skill on that board. Half of that is from the executives and the other half is from not executive directors. But the second highest knowledge base on the board by influence is computers and electronics, and it's all the non-executive directors. They are effectively looking at innovation, technology as the core competency required to be on a biotech or biopharma firm. Where in oil and gas, they are not looking at it that way. And they are not looking at it like they need to innovate out of this problem. That's why Darren Wood spends 45 minutes talking about carbon capture, setting scope 2 targets that they can meet, some general efficiency metrics, and not talking about perhaps we need to figure out either a new thing to do with the oil that we do pump, or we need to pivot away from oil entirely as a revenue source.
It's interesting that you mentioned this, because when you combine the very short tenures of American CEOs and CFOs with the extra short tenure of board members at oil and gas companies, it suggests that the people, the investors are voting in, really only have a short-term interest in the company, right? They're not thinking about Exxon 20 years from now, let alone thinking about the effects that Exxon could have on the world.
And I would say, though, that the tenures of the CEOs aren't necessarily short because Darren Woods has been at Exxon since 1992. These are lifers who generally get these jobs.
He's been CEO since 2016.
He's been CEO since 2016, but he's been at the company since 92. So to get these jobs, they're not hiring outside of the company. They are keeping the companies largely intact by maintaining sort of a lifer status. Like lifers get the CEO role, and the boards cycle really, really quickly as mature boards, and they're all highly connected, so they're all friends, and they have a short-term interest to keep recycling themselves.
Yeah.
It is a very bizarre dynamic that's unique to oil and gas. So let's go company by company through the big three, because I think when you go through, I think there's sort of a three-part recommendation, which is this year you need to focus, and this is sector-wide, you want to focus on the independent directors who have high influence, where you can create some influence void so that you can get rid of some of these duplicative skills. In the next 2 to 3 years, you really need to focus on the knowledge skills mix. And I don't mean like you need to add a climate change expert. I mean, you need to add open-minded, innovative, other sort of like tech experience onto these boards, and you need to break up the highly insular connected boards.
You're essentially suggesting what companies always say when they do layoffs and restructuring is get rid of the redundancy. That's basically what you're saying, right?
That's all I'm saying.
Why can't that apply to the boards?
Hire out the redundancy. So when you look at Chevron, we'll start with Chevron. Chevron is obviously owned by Vanguard and BlackRock, but it's also got a big stake with Berkshire Hathaway is a Chevron investor. They own Buffett, almost 7% of Chevron. Overall, the performance is just like everyone else, terrible controversies. This is a board that is one of the most connected. This is a classic Ron Sugar board. If you listen to the show, you know who Ron Sugar is. In fact, Ron Sugar was on the board of Chevron, and his fingerprints are all over it. The companies that are represented here include Lockheed, Duke Energy, McDonald's, Wells Fargo, Caterpillar, Uber, Amgen, 3M. These are classic American companies with professional directors running them.
I was going to say, for our world, these are some of the most famous directors in our world. Marilyn Houston, John Huntsman, Enrique Hernandez, Wanda Austin. These are big names.
These are all big names.
Database. Yeah.
And I would say that, ironically, somehow, on this board, the knowledge skills mix is actually one that you would hope for. Building and construction is the largest knowledge base represented. Mechanical, biology, those are the next two. What you're missing is engineering. In fact, the only one with engineering as a core knowledge set is Chevron, but it's really minimal. One of their directors, Alice Gast, she's a chemical engineer who spent the better part of 15 years promoting investment in climate change. She's a climate change investor, but through the lens of biodiesels, right? Like she does fluid dynamics and things like that. You have Wanda Austin, who's an academic. She was an aerospace exec, but she has an engineering background. She was on Obama Science Council. She has a deep history of innovation. And all three women, in fact. Cynthia Warner is the last who's focused on renewables also, but came from the oil and gas sector. The rest of this board, outside of those three, and they do not have a tremendous amount of influence, is utter cronies. Just to be blunt about it, there are 122 loops between them, including 42 loops between current directors. This is one of the most pick your friends and put them on boards that in our database, frankly.
Well, it doesn't surprise me because one of those people you're talking about is Enrique Hernandez, who we talk about a lot. Part of it is his involvement on the board of McDonald's, right?
So let's start with the recommendation: vote against Enrique Hernandez.
Yeah. Rick Hernandez actually has been one of the directors who has consistently received high votes against over the term of his career.
You have to ask the question: How does a guy whose background is in home security systems, whose prior board seats, even if you looked at him and said, oh, he's been on a lot of professional boards, they include McDonald's, where he oversaw Easterbrook's clawback for like non-disclosure of a relationship he had. Wells Fargo, he was the chair of the board there during the account scandal. Like it was his responsibility there. He's on the board of a company right now called Macerich. They're about to default on half their properties. This is a guy who jumps from board to board. Everywhere he's gone, there have been terrible outcomes. Everywhere.
And let's not forget, at his core, this is a guy whose experience in the business world was because he inherited the company that his father founded. He's a nepo baby in our world.
I'm not sure how you get a seat on Chevron with those qualifications, except if you're just there because you know the people and you're cool with management. That's not what you want in the board going forward. You can't afford that. You don't have time if you believe the 3 rules.
It might be who CEO and chair Michael Wirth wants, but he wouldn't be in the interests of shareholders.
And the second one I'm saying vote against is Wick Moorman, whose name might be familiar to you.
Wick Moorman, okay. Wick?
Wick. His name might be familiar to you because he is actually the ex-CEO of Norfolk Southern. He's the one who had the problem with the safety. All of the safety problems happened under his watch.
Wow.
He has 11% influence on this board. He's basically the godfather of poor safety experience.
He is the chair of the compensation committee, Wick.
And he's on the nominating committee, and he's the oldest member of the board. Do we want the Wick Moorman network of friends leading Chevron into the future?
And I will say, I want to point out why this is maybe important, is that, we're talking about Chevron, which pays its CEO $24 million. Exxon, I think, pays its CEO $36 million. But you look at Shell, which is not based in the U.S., somehow they're managing to do it just under $10 million. So you should pay attention to who the chair of the pay committee is if you care about stuff like that.
The future votes I suggest for Chevron, it was really hard to choose because they are all so intertwined. But Deborah Reed Clage, who's on Boeing, and Marilyn Houston are people to look at in the next round of votes.
Okay.
Let's get to Exxon.
And again, we're going to put this all up on LinkedIn, right?
Yeah, it'll all be on our website, and I'll link to it on there. First of all, the news about Exxon is how they're suing Arjuna Capital.
Yes.
There's no way around the fact that somehow the lead independent director, who is the ex-CEO of State Street, who is an investor, is suing an investor because they didn't like the shareholder proposal they put up. Even when they retracted the shareholder proposal, they are maintaining the lawsuit to send a point. We hate you, environmentalists. Stop it with these hijacking the shareholder process from the quote-unquote real shareholders. Yeah, that is what this is about.
You're talking about Joseph Hooley, as you mentioned, the lead director at Exxon. He's the chair of the nomination committee. He's the second most powerful member of this board. This
board also has Larry Kellner on it, who you'll remember as the chair of the Boeing board, who's now stepping down. Look, I will say this. Like you said, we watched that 40-minute interview with Darren Woods, the CEO. And Darren Woods is a incredibly smart, slick operator. Every question, he's nailing every. By the end of it, he has you willing to sell your children to his company, except the question about Arjuna Capital and suing shareholders, where he could barely veil his anger and his disdain of them.
He visibly turns a little bit red and starts to shake a little bit.
I mean, this isn't deep analysis, but he very clearly hates them. He thinks they are ruining the process. They are in the way, and it's barely veiled in their letter to Glass Lewis that in their recent filing, and in their actual proxy statement, where they go on for a page and a half about how the process got hijacked and shareholder proposals basically are, environmentalists are using it
form
to
of
ruin
abuse,
his company.
Abuse and hijack, yeah. And let's not forget that he attacks Glass Lewis essentially for siding with shareholders and not with management. That's really the core of their argument, is that you're partnering and listening to a bunch of shareholder groups, but you're not. But what you should be doing is just voting for management. That's the core of their argument.
He says you weighed on this before already. You said no. No means no. You should just side with us. Here's my recommendations.
Yeah.
Vote against Jay Hooley.
Which Glass Lewis also is recommending a vote against Joe Hooley.
Right. And Woods does not like that. I don't care. The knowledge map for Hooley is economic finance. He's the worst carbon performer, not just on this board, but of all the big three. And this is not a person who's sitting on carbon heavy boards. I'm talking carbon intensity per $1 million revenue, carbon released. So this is a normalized basis. He's still the worst performer out of the big three. And he's on another board. He's not going to be homeless. This is not a guy who needs this board seat, but he very clearly is willing to antagonizing other shareholders despite being a shareholder. That was his life.
And let me add before you go on. While I do agree with Glass Lewis targeting Joseph Hooley, the part that I think they don't go far enough is that they also should be suggesting that shareholders vote against Darren Woods.
That is my second vote.
Okay, good.
That
because again, a shareholder vote against Darren Woods does not remove Darren Woods from the company that he's served at since 1992. Shareholders do not have the right to displace management. But they don't need to have the CEO on the board, and they could vote against Darren Woods here in this case.
I also don't think Darren Woods earns himself a position on the board when he's repeatedly saying about misinformation campaigns that Exxon has been running for 30 years. He's saying that was the past. He's been at Exxon since 1992. That's your past. It's your company. So you can pretend that it didn't happen by saying that's the past, I'm dealing with the future, except that you are suing investors you don't like, the investors you don't like, and it's your past. We're not upset about the history of some newcomer to Exxon who had nothing to do with that. This is squarely under your purview while you've been there.
Yeah. And what Matt's referring to is that in this interview with Fortune magazine, he does explicitly say, I'm not here to talk about the past.
Yes. He doesn't want to talk about the misinformation campaigns that Exxon has been running for decades. And finally, vote against Larry Kellner. For once, I agree with the National Public Policy Legal Center, which I can't remember.
Anti-ESG.
The anti-ESG group.
The anti-ESG hand-wringers.
Their thinking here is he's terrible on Boeing. You should vote against him here. I don't think that's wrong. I think if you're not a good director, you're not a good director. We can demonstrate that he has a legacy of overseeing a failing airline, because he was the CEO of Continental, that he's parlayed into a legacy of a failing airline manufacturer onto the board of Exxon. I think that there's merit to the fact that you shouldn't be failing up. You shouldn't be failing up.
Exactly why I started this show with the announcement from WEC Energy Group, which attributing positive performance to their chair and paying him extra because of that. We can also attribute negative performance to board members as well.
I think that's correct.
I'll agree with you, WEC Energy Group. And again, that's why I started with that report.
And finally, I want to end on Shell before we get into the 7th hour of the show. Shell is the clear winner of the big three. Not least of which, in part because they're based in the UK, which means the rules are already different in and of themselves. But the knowledge base, first of all, the investor, the non-executive directors on this board, engineering and technology knowledge are their core strength. This is the company with the strongest carbon intensity performance as a group, and I'm talking about the directors, not the company itself. So everywhere they go, they're pretty good at it. They have the lowest interconnectivity of the big three, and the history of interconnectivity has steadily been shed. They also wrote in their proxy statement or in their annual statement, the board is grateful for the time and contribution of all those stakeholders who provided feedback and for the overall indications of support for Shell's strategy. They actually are thanking their investors despite having 20 plus resolutions. And while many of them are management resolutions, they're also facing shareholder resolutions. I think the only one I think you vote against this year is And Godbeher, whose name I'm butchering. but she has 14% influence. She's the longest tenured on this board. She's overall just a mediocre performer, and her knowledge base is heavy and economic, and you don't need more than that. She has an accounting and banking background and some exposure to some less stellar boards in British Tobacco and Stellantis. She's also the most connected director. But this is a much more tepid sort of recommendation here, because this is actually a board that seems to be doing largely what it's supposed to be doing. I'm going to stop there. If you want more analysis, because we have the full analysis on every single oil and gas company in the sector, and we have knowledge maps of all of them, reach out to us. Hit us up.
These knowledge maps are wonderful. I know you're going to post them online, so we're going to be talking more about these. This is very new to what we cover here, so we're going to be talking more about these on our shows. That's all you have, Matt, today?
That's all I have for today. The shareholder proposals are, there's so many of them. We'll have to cover them in a different, in retrospective, but that's what we've got for today.
That's the Proxy Countdown for the week of May 13th, 2024. Join us next week when we jump back into the alternative democracy pool. Forever on the lookout for shareholder sharks, floating band-aids, and wayward directors.